Alright, with this week's module we're going to examine some basic principles of forest ecosystem function. We'll take a look first at the different competitive strategies of some tree species. We're going to develop a broad understanding of the process of forest succession and also talk a little bit about how forest management may impact ecosystem function. I've decided to save the discussion of landscape ecology for later in the semester. If you look on the syllabus, landscape ecology was supposed to follow up with this module, but we're gonna push that off till later on when we'll go through some concepts of landscape ecology when we start to look a little closer at wildlife habitat, because those two topics go hand in hand. So this week we're going to focus on ecosystem function at a relatively small spatial scale. First, we need to establish what an ecosystem is. We can classify an ecosystem as a biotic community, a living community, and its abiotic environment, a non-living environment functioning as a system. Here we're primarily concerned with forest ecosystems. The term terrestrial ecosystem refers to land ecosystems in general as opposed to aquatic ecosystems or water ecosystems. Trees and animals, including humans, are the most obvious living components of forest ecosystems, but we can't neglect the microorganisms, particularly those in the soil that do the work of decomposition and nutrient cycling. Air, water, bedrock, and the mineral component of soil are really the fundamental abiotic components. Ecosystems are defined by the resident plant and animal species as well as by soil type and position on the landscape. So whenever you tack an ology on the end of something, you're referencing the study of it. So the term ecology refers to the study of ecosystems and their function. And so this can't be overemphasized. The study of forest ecology provides the foundation for forest management. And as we'll discuss in later modules, forestry is really just applied forest ecology. It amounts to creating or mitigating ecological disturbances to meet the needs of society. The harvesting techniques we utilize to endorse the establishment of a particular group of species is really only going to be successful if we're able to mimic the natural disturbance that would result in their establishment in our absence. So as a forester, this is what you do. You create disturbance. We harvest trees, we utilize prescribed fire, we do all sorts of things with the intent of altering forest structure to grow a particular group of species in a particular way. As you guys are all aware, the specific objectives of our management activities vary, but our management typically boils down to either the intentional introduction of disturbance or the intentional avoidance of disturbance, as would be the case with wildfire suppression. If we're going to be successful at achieving our management goals, we need a comprehensive understanding of how trees grow, how forests develop over time, and how energy, nutrients, and carbon flow through the ecosystem. Ecology is essentially the study of these processes. The first step is developing an understanding of the factors that determine tree species distribution. All these should look familiar as they were covered in the biome lecture as well. Different trees have different competitive strategies, and they respond differently to natural disturbances within the ecosystem. Species vary across the landscape based on the influence of climate, soil, and disturbance regime. Physiologically, trees are adapted to different environmental situations. And so this brings us to the concept of niche. A niche is simply the physical environment where a species occurs based on its adaptations to the environmental factors just described. So the term physiological niche is the environment that a species can tolerate in the absence of competition. But as we know, that isn't really how things work in the environment, in the natural world. Site resources like sunlight, water, soil nutrients, and space, they're all limited things. And this results in competition when there's not enough of those to go around. This brings us to the concept of ecological niche. And this is the term you're going to want to remember. Ecological niche refers to the environment that a species can tolerate when growing in association with other plants. So it's the place where a tree is physiologically adapted to grow and can do so successfully in the presence of competition from other tree species. As we know, forest ecosystems are constantly changing, and we're gonna examine the concept of forest succession in a moment. It's important to understand that each species maintains competitive strategies to compete in a given forest environment at a given point in time during the development of that forest as succession progresses. Ruderal species are those species that occupy a niche with high resource availability. They are physiologically adapted to compete vigorously in situations where sunlight, water, nutrients, and space are not limited. This environment exists immediately following a catastrophic disturbance or a stand replacing disturbance. These species are also those that readily establish in fields that are left fallow, abandoned farmland, abandoned pasture. Ruderal species, including yellow poplar, black locust, Virginia pine, and some others, are species that grow rapidly. They allocate photosynthetic resources to rapid height growth rather than root development. Another part of their competitive strategy is the ability to reproduce prolifically. They're heavy seeders, or they sprout vigorously when disturbed. Competitor species occupy a niche where disturbance is less frequent and competition for resources is really high. There are a whole lot of species that fall into this category. There are some species that are highly competitive in a variety of situations. In the eastern United States, red maple is a highly competitive generalist. It is a very common component to many forest communities in the eastern part of the country. Red maple is intermediate in shade tolerance. It can become established and remain viable in a variety of sunlight conditions, but it also grows relatively fast. So red maple is well suited to take advantage of disturbances that remove portions of the main forest canopy. It sprouts vigorously from the stump if harvested, and it's a relatively prolific seeder as well, but it can also remain viable in the understory for an extended period of time. It is a strong competitor with a variety of competitive strategies. The final niche category we'll examine are the stress-tolerant species. These are the species that occupy areas where site resources are the most limited. They're species that survive in these conditions are those that are adapted to the limited site resources. They're not necessarily strong competitors. They're just physiologically adapted to grow where many other species cannot. In contrast to ruderal species, these species allocate growth to their root systems first rather than to their shoots or main stems. The reason for this is that for these species in these growing conditions, it is more important that they get at the limited amount of moisture and the limited amount of nutrients that are present in the soil. It's more important for them to do that rather than grow rapidly to outcompete other species. So height growth is slow, but they can survive where others cannot. Blackjack oak is an example of a stress-tolerant species here in the southeast. You find it on dry, acidic soil where nutrients and moisture are the most limited. They grow really slowly, but again, they grow where others typically cannot. Of all the things that influence where a species may thrive, light tolerance may be the most important to us as foresters. The amount of sunlight a tree receives is really the site resource that we have the most influence on through management. As I mentioned, I think in the biome lecture, we refer to trees that grow and compete well in open growing conditions where sunlight is not limited as shade intolerant. Shade-tolerant trees are those that remain viable in the understory, viable under the shade of other species, and have the ability to respond to small disturbances in the canopy. This slide here shows the two different species that exemplify each light tolerance strategy. The picture on the left is of naturally regenerated green ash seedlings that have become established following a clear cut. This image is from a harvesting operation in the central hardwood region, a little bit north of here, a little bit northwest of here. And so you typically wouldn't find a situation exactly like this in the southern Appalachians, but green ash behaves a little differently here. But it's a really good example of an intolerant species readily occupying a recently disturbed site. In contrast, The sugar maple seedlings on the right are doing what shade-tolerant seedlings do. It's remaining viable in the understory. The seedlings are growing slowly, but they can survive in the understory for an extended period of time. They're just waiting to be released by a small canopy disturbance. Light tolerance varies for really two reasons of physiology that we're going to focus on. The light compensation point of shade-intolerant species is lower than that of tolerant species. What this means is that for shade-intolerant species, the amount of light required for photosynthesis to support the function of existing biomass is lower. To put it another way, photosynthesis results in growth only after the trees allocate enough photosynthetic material to support the function of tree material already produced. After that, additional photosynthetic material can be allocated to new tree material. That's growth. And so the amount of sunlight needed to reach that point is lower for intolerant species. More net growth occurs in the presence of the same amount of light when compared to a tolerant species. Additionally, trees can only use so much sunlight. There's a point in all species where an increase in sunlight will not result in any additional growth. This point is known as the light saturation point, and it is higher for shade-tolerant species. There are other environmental constraints to photosynthesis that may influence what tree species are able to become established and survive in a given setting. Cold air and cold soil restricts photosynthesis because moisture is less available. In really hot conditions, trees lose more moisture to transpiration than what is gained from the environment. Therefore, growth doesn't occur. Also, the nutrient content of the soil, and again, it's as determined by the soil forming factors that we've examined in previous lectures, influences the ability of a tree to conduct basic physiological function. The process by which carbon moves through the ecosystem is important for several reasons. First, CO2 is essential for photosynthesis to occur, and it's the source of carbon needed for plants to build organic compounds as autotrophs. Also, the balance of carbon among carbon pools in the environment has really far-reaching impacts on ecosystem function and ecosystem health. Carbon is present in the atmosphere naturally, and it may be stored within plant biomass, animal biomass, microbial biomass, and also in soil organic matter. These are the pools that I'm talking about. So carbon in the atmosphere exists as CO2, where it's incorporated into organic material by plants. As plant material dies, it's decomposed and broken down by soil microbes. This microbial biomass in the soil, again, is another carbon pool. As animals eat plants, carbon is pooled in their biomass as well. CO2 is released into the atmosphere as plants and animals respire and as plants and animals die and become decomposed. The burning of fossil fuel results in the addition of carbon into the atmosphere as CO2 as well. This additional carbon is essentially organic material that has been stored for millions of years in the form of coal, petroleum, or natural gas. And when these materials are utilized as an energy source, when they're burned as an energy source, as has been the case in the U.S. since the Industrial Revolution, that carbon that has been stored for millions of years is rapidly released into the atmosphere as atmospheric carbon or CO2, resulting in a concentration of CO2 well beyond what plants can utilize. As you guys should be aware, CO2 is a greenhouse gas and a primary factor in global climate change.